Hello, it's Cassandra with Vine. Yesterday, we heard about how Black Beauty's new home was not quite as nice as his old home. Don't worry, by the end of today's chapters, he'll be moving yet again. We also heard about a time that he saved another rider through his quick speed and his strong heart. Let's keep reading. Chapter 25. Reuben Smith. I must now say a little about Reuben Smith, who was left in charge of the stables when York went to London. No one more thoroughly understood his business than he did, and when he was all right, there could not be a more faithful or valuable man. He was gentle and very clever in his management of horses, and could doctor them almost as well as a farrier, for he had lived 2 years with a veterinary surgeon. He was a first-rate driver. He could take a four-in-hand or a tandem as easily as a pair. He was a handsome man, a good scholar, and had very pleasant manners. I believe everybody liked him. Certainly the horses did. The only wonder was that he should be in an under situation, and not in a place of head coachman like York. But he had one great fault, and that was the love of drink. He was not like some men, always at it. He used to keep steady for weeks or months together. Then he would break out and have a bout of it, as York called it, and be a disgrace to himself, a terror to his wife, and a nuisance to all that had to do with him. He was, however, so useful that 2 or 3 times York had hushed the matter up and kept it from the Earl's knowledge. But one night, when Reuben had to drive a party home from a ball, he was so drunk he could not hold the reins, and a gentleman of the party had to mount the box and drive the ladies home. Of course, this could not be hidden, and Reuben was at once dismissed. His poor wife and little children had to turn out of the pretty cottage by the park gate and go where they could. Old Max told me all of this, for it happened a good while ago. But shortly before Ginger and I came, Smith had been taken back again. York had interceded for him with the Earl, who was very kind-hearted, and the man had promised faithfully he would never taste another drop as long as he lived there. He had kept his promise so well that York thought he might be safely trusted to fill his place when he was away, and he was so clever and honest that no one else seemed so well fitted for it. It was now early in April, and the family was expected home sometime in May. The light bowman was freshly done up, and the Colonel Blantyre was obliged to return to his regiment. It was arranged that Smith should drive him to town in it and ride back for this purpose. He took the saddle with him, and I was chosen for the journey. At the station, the Colonel put some money into Smith's hand and bid him goodbye, saying, "Take care of our young mistress, Reuben, and don't let Black Auster be hacked about by some random young prig that wants to ride him. Keep him for the lady." We left the carriage at the maker's, and Smith rode me to the White Lion and ordered the holster to feed me well and had me ready for him at 4 o'clock. A nail in one of my front shoes had started as I came along, but the holster did not notice it till just about 4 o'clock. Smith did not come into the yard till 5, and then he said he should not leave till 6, as he had met some old friends. The man then told him of the nail, and asked if he should have the shoe looked into. "No," said Smith, "that will be all right till we get home." He spoke in a very loud, off-hand way, and I thought it very unlike him to not see about the shoe, as he was generally wonderfully particular about loose nails in our shoes. He did not come at 6, nor at 7, nor at 8, and it was not nearly 9 o'clock before he called for me, and then it was with a loud, rough voice. He seemed in a very bad temper, and abused the holster, and though I could not tell what for. The landlord stood at the door and said, "Have a care, Mr. Smith." But he answered angrily with an oath, and almost before he was out of town he began to gallop, frequently giving me a sharp cut with his whip, though I was going at full speed. The moon was not yet risen, and it was very dark. The roads were stony, having been recently mended. Going over them at this pace, my shoe became looser, and when we were near the turnpike gate, it came off. If Smith had been in his right senses, he would have been sensible of something wrong in my pace, but he was too madly drunk to notice anything. Beyond the turnpike there was a long piece of road, upon which fresh stones had been laid. Large, sharp stones, over which no horse could be driven quickly without risk of danger. over this road, with one shoe gone, I was forced to gallop at my utmost speed, my rider meanwhile cutting into me with his whip, and with wild curses urging me to go still faster. Of course, my shoeless foot suffered dreadfully. The hoof was broken and split down to the very quick, and the inside was terribly cut by the sharpness of the stones. This could not go on. No horse could keep his footing under such circumstances. The pain was too great. I stumbled and fell with violence on both my knees. Smith was flung off by my fall, and owing to the speed I was going at, he must have fallen with great force. I soon recovered my feet and limped to the side of the road, where it was free from stone. The moon had just risen above the hedge, and by its light I could see Smith lying a few yards beyond me. He did not rise. He made one slight effort to do so, and then there was a heavy groan. I could have groaned too, for I was suffering intense pain both from my foot and my knees. But horses are used to bear their pain in silence. I uttered no sound, but I stood there and listened. One more heavy groan from Smith, but though he now lay in the full moonlight, I could see no motion. I could do nothing for him nor myself, but oh, how I listened for the sound of a horse or wheels or footsteps. The road was not much frequented, and at this time of night we might stay for hours before help came to us. I stood watching and listening. It was a calm, sweet April night. There were no sounds but a few low notes of a nightingale, and nothing moved but the white clouds near the moon and a brown owl that flitted over the hedge. It made me think of the summer nights long ago when I used to lie beside my mother in the green pleasant meadow at Farmer Gray's. Chapter 26. How it ended. It must have been nearly midnight when I heard a great distance the sound of a horse's feet. Sometimes the sound died away, and then it grew clearer again and nearer. The road to Earlshaw led through plantations that belonged to the Earl. The sound came from that direction, and I hoped it might be someone coming in search of us. As the sound came nearer and nearer, I was almost sure I could distinguish Ginger's step. A little nearer still, and I could tell she was in the dog-cart. I neighed loudly, and was overjoyed to hear an answering neigh from Ginger, and men's voices. They came slowly over the stones and stopped at the dark figure that lay upon the ground. One of the men jumped out and stooped over it. "It's Reuben," he said, "and he does not stir." The other man followed and bent over him. "He's dead," he said. "Feel how cold his hands are." They raised him up, but there was no life, and his hair was soaked with blood. They laid him down again and came and looked at me. They saw my cut knees. Why, the horse has been down and thrown him. Who would have thought that Black Horse would have done this? Nobody thought he could fall. Reuben must have been lying here for hours. Odd, too, that the horse has not moved from the place. Robert then attempted to lead me forward. I made a step, but almost fell again. "Halloo, he's bad in the foot as well as his knees. Look here. His hoof is cut all into pieces. He might well come down, poor fellow. I tell you what, Ned, I'm afraid it hasn't been all right with Reuben. Just think of him riding a horse over these stones without a shoe. Why, if he had been in his right senses, he would have just as soon have tried to ride him over the moon. I'm afraid it has been the old thing over again. Poor Susan, she looked awfully pale when she came to my house to ask if he had not come home. She made believe she was not a bit anxious, and talked of a lot of things that might have kept him, but for all that, she begged me to go and meet him. But what must we do? There's a horse to get home as well as a body, and that will be no easy matter." Then followed a conversation between them, till it was agreed that Robert, as the groom, should lead me, and that Ned take the body. It was a hard job to get it into the dog-cart, for there was no one to hold Ginger, but she knew as well as I did what was going on, and stood as still as stone. I noticed that, because if she had had a fault, it was that she was impatient in standing. Ned started off very slowly with the sad load, and Robert came and looked at my foot again. Then he took his handkerchief and bound it closely round, so led me home. I shall never forget that night walk. It was more than 3 miles. Robert led me on very slowly, and I limped and hobbled on as well as I could with great pain. I am sure he was sorry for me. for he often patted and encouraged me, talking to me in a pleasant voice. At last I reached my own box and had some corn, and after Robert had wrapped up my knees in wet cloths, he tied up my foot in a bran poultice to draw out the heat and cleanse it before the horse doctor saw it in the morning. And I managed to get myself down on the straw and sleep in spite of the pain. The next day, after the farrier had examined my wounds, he said he hoped the joint was not injured, and if so, I should not be spoiled for work, but I shall never lose the blemish. I believe they did the best to make a good cure. But it was a long and painful one. Proud flesh, they called it, came up in my knees, and it was burned out with caustic. And when at last it was healed, they put a blistering fluid over the front of both knees to bring off all the hair off. They had some reason for this, and I supposed it was all right. As Smith's death had been so sudden, and no one was there to see it, there was an inquest held. The landlord and holster at the White Lion, with several other people, gave evidence that he was intoxicated when he started from the inn. The keeper of the toll gate said he rode at a hard gallop through the gate, and that my shoe was picked up among the stones, so that case was quite plain to them, and I was cleared of all blame. Everybody pitied Susan. She was nearly out of her mind. She kept saying over and over again, "Oh, he was so good, so good. It was all that cursed drink. Why will they sell that cursed drink? Oh, Reuben, Reuben." She went on till after he was buried, and then she had no home or relations. She, with her 6 little children, was obliged once more to leave the pleasant home by the tall oak trees and go into the great gloomy Union House. Chapter 27. Ruined and Going Downhill. As soon as my knees were sufficiently healed, I was turned into a small meadow for a month or 2. No other creature was there, and though I enjoyed the liberty and the sweet grass, yet I had been so long used to society that I felt very lonely. Ginger and I had become fast friends, and now I missed her company extremely. I often neighed when I heard horses' feet passing in the road, but I seldom got an answer, till one morning the gate was opened, and who should come in but dear old Ginger. The man slipped off her halter and left her there. With a joyful whinny I trotted up to her. We were both glad to meet, but I soon found that it was not for our pleasure that she was brought to be with me. Her story would be too long to tell, but the end of it was that she had been ruined by hard riding, and was now turned off to see what the rest would do. Lord George was young and would take no warning. He was a hard rider and would hunt whenever he could get the chance, quite careless of his horse. Soon after I left the stable, there was a steeplechase, and he was determined to ride. Though the groom told him she was a little strained and was not fit for the race, he did not believe it, and on the day of the race urged Ginger to keep up with the foremost riders. With her high spirit, she strained herself to the utmost. She came in with the first 3 horses, but her wind was touched, besides which he was too heavy for her and her back was strained. And so she said, "Here we are, ruined in the prime of our youth and strength, you by a drunkard and I by a fool. It is very hard." We both felt in ourselves that we were not what we had been. However, that did not spoil the pleasure we had in each other's company. We did not gallop about as we once did, but we used to feed and lie down and stand for hours under the shady trees with our heads close together, and so we passed our time till the family returned from town. One day we saw the Earl come into the meadow, and York was with him. Seeing who it was, we stood still under our lime tree, and let them come to us. They examined us carefully. The Earl seemed much annoyed. "There is 300 pounds flung away for no earthly use," he said. "But what I care for most is that these horses are my old friends, who thought they would find a good home with me, are ruined. The mare shall have 12 months' run, and we shall see what that will do for her, but the black one must be sold. 'Tis a great pity, but I could not have knees like this in my stable." "No, my lord, of course not," said York, "but he might get a place where appearance is not of much consequence, and still be well treated. I know of a man in Bath the master of some livery stables, who often wants a good horse at a low figure. I know he looks well after his horses. The inquest cleared the horse's character, and your lordship's recommendation or mine would be sufficient warrant of him. You'd better write to him, York. I should be more particular about the place than the money he would fetch us. After this, they left us. They'll soon take you away, said Ginger, and I shall lose the only friend I have, and most likely we shall never see each other again. 'Tis a hard world. About a week after this, Robert came into the field with a halter, which he slipped over my head and led me away. There was no leave-taking of Ginger. We neighed to each other as I was led off, and she trotted anxiously along by the hedge, calling to me as long as she could hear the sound of my feet. Through the recommendation of York, I was brought by my master to the livery stables. I had to go by train, which was new to me, and required a good deal of courage the first time. But as I was fond of puffing, rushing, whistling, and more than all, the trembling of a horse in the box which I stood did me no real harm. I soon took to it quietly. When I reached the end of my journey, I found myself in a tolerably comfortable stable and well attended to. These stables were not so airy and pleasant as the ones I'd been used to. The stalls were laid on a slope instead of being level, and as my head was kept tied to the manger, I was obliged to stand on the slope, which was very fatiguing. Men did not seem to know that horses can do more work if they stand comfortably and can turn about. However, I was well fed and well cleaned, and on the whole I think my master took as much care of us as he could. He kept a good many horses and carriages of different kinds for hire. Sometimes his own men drove them. At others, the horse and chaise were let to gentlemen or ladies who drove themselves. Chapter 28. A Job Horse and His Drivers. Hitherto I'd always been driven by people who at least knew how to drive, but in this place I was to get my experience of all different kinds of bad and ignorant driving to which we horses are subjected. For I was a job horse, and was led out to all sorts of people who wished to hire me. And as I was good-tempered and gentle, I think I was oftener led out to the ignorant drivers than some of the other horses, because I could be depended on. It would take a long time to tell all the different styles of which I was driven, but I will mention a few of them. First, there were the tight-rein drivers, men who seemed to think that all depended on holding the reins as hard as they could, never relaxing the pull on the horse's mouth or giving him the liberty of movement. They are always talking about keeping the horse well in hand and holding a horse up, just as if the horse were not made to hold himself up. Some poor broken-down horses, whose mouths have been made hard and insensible by such drivers as these, may, perhaps, find some support in it. But for a horse who can depend on his own legs, and who has a tender mouth, is easily guided, it is not only tormenting, but it is stupid. Then there are the loose-rein drivers, who let the reins lie easily on our backs, and their own hands rest lazily on their knees. Of course, such gentlemen have no control over a horse. If anything happens suddenly, if the horse shies or starts or stumbles, they are nowhere, and cannot help the horse or themselves till the mischief is done. Of course, for myself, I had no objection to it, as I was not in the habit either of starting or stumbling, and had only been used to depend on my driver for guidance and encouragement. Still, one likes to feel the rein a little in going downhill, and likes to know that one's driver has not gone to sleep. Besides, this slovenly way of driving gets a horse into bad and often lazy habits, and when he changes hands, he has to be whipped out of them with more or less pain and trouble. Squire Gordon always kept us to our best paces and our best manners. He said that spoiling a horse and letting him into bad habits was just as cruel as spoiling a child, and both had to suffer for it afterwards. Besides, these drivers are often careless altogether, and will attend to anything else rather than their horses. I went out in the phaeton one day with one of them. He had a lady and 2 children behind. He flopped the reins about as we started, and of course gave me several unmeaning cuts with the whip, though I was fairly off. There had been a good deal of road mending going on, and even where the stones were not freshly laid down, there was a great many loose ones. My driver was laughing and joking with the lady and children and talking about the country to the right and the left, but he never thought it worth while to keep an eye on his horse, or to drive to the smoothest parts of the road, and so it easily happened that I got a stone in one of my sore feet. Now, if Mr. Gordon or John, or in fact any good driver had been there, he would have seen that something was wrong before I had gone 3 paces. Or even if it had been dark, a practiced hand would have felt by the rain that there was something wrong in my step, and he would have gone down and picked out the stone. But this man went on laughing and talking, while at every step the stone became more firmly wedged between my shoe and the frog of my foot. The stone was so sharp on the inside and round on the outside, which, as everyone knows, is the most dangerous. The most dangerous kind that a horse can pick up, at the same time cutting his foot and making him most liable to stumble and fall. Whether the man was partly blind or only very careless, I can't say, but he drove with me with that stone in my foot for a good half-mile before he saw anything. By that time I was going so lame with pain that at last he saw it and called out, "Well, here's a go. Why, they've sent us out on a lame horse. What a shame." Then he chucked the reins and flipped the whip, saying, "Now then, it's no use playing the old soldier with me. There's the journey to go, and there's no turning lame and lazy." Just at this time a farmer came riding up on a brown cob. He lifted his hat and pulled up. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, "but I think there is something the matter with your horse. He goes very much as if he had a stone in his shoe. If you will allow me, I will look at his feet. These loose scattered stones are confounded dangerous things for horses." "He's a hired horse, sire," said the driver. "I don't know what's the matter with him, but it's a great shame to send out a lame beast like this." The farmer dismounted and slipped his rein up over his arm, and at once took my near foot. Bless me, there's a stone. Lame. I should think so. At first he tried to dislodge it with his hand, but as it was now very tightly wedged, he drew a stone pick out of his pocket and very carefully, and with some trouble, got it out. Then holding it up, he said, "There, that's the stone your horse had picked up. It's a wonder he did not fall down and break his knees in the bargain." "Well, to be sure," said my driver. "That's a queer thing. I never knew that horses picked up stones before." "Didn't you?" said the farmer, rather contemptuously. "But they do, though, and the best of them will do it, and can't help it sometimes on such roads as these. And if you don't want to lame your horse, you must look sharp and get them out quickly. This foot is very much bruised," he said, setting it gently down and patting me. "If I might advise, sir, you had better drive him gently for a while. The foot is a great deal hurt, and the lameness will not go off directly." Then, mounting his cob and raising his hat to the lady, he trotted off. When he was gone, my driver began to flop the reins about and whip the harness, by which I understood I was to go on, which of course I did, glad the stone was gone, but still in a great deal of pain. This was a sort of experience we job horses often came in for. Cockneys. Chapter 29. Then there's a steam engine style of driving. These drivers were mostly people from towns, who never got a horse of their own, and generally traveled by rail. They always seemed to think that a horse was something like a steam engine, only smaller. At any rate, they think that if they pay for it, a horse is bound to go just as far, just as fast, and with just as heavy a load as they please. And be the roads heavy and muddy, or dry and good, be they stony or smooth, uphill or downhill, it is all the same, on and on and on. One must go on at the same pace, with no relief and no consideration. These people never think of getting out to walk up a steep hill. Oh no, they have paid to ride, and ride they will. The horse? Oh, he's used to it. What were these horses made for, if not to drag people uphill? Walk, a good joke indeed, and so the whip is plied and the rein is chucked, and often a rough, scolding voice cries out, "Go along, you lazy beast," and then another slash of the whip, when all the time we were doing our very best to get along, uncomplaining and obedient, though often sorely harassed and downhearted. The steam engine style of driving wears up faster than any other kind. I would far rather go 20 miles with a good, considerate driver than I would go 10 with some of these. It would take less out of me. Another thing, they scarcely ever put on the drag. however steep the downhill may be, and thus bad accidents sometimes happen, or if they do put it on, they often forget to take it off at the bottom of the hill. And more than once I have had to pull halfway up the next hill with one of my wheels lodged fast in a drag shoe before my driver chose to think about it. And that is a terrible strain on a horse. Then these cockneys, instead of starting at an easy pace as a gentleman would do, generally set off at full speed from the very stable yard, and when they want to stop, they first whip at us and then pull up so suddenly that we are nearly thrown on our haunches and our mouths jagged with the bit. They call it pulling up with a dash, and when they turn the corner, they do it just as sharply as if there was no right side or wrong side of the road. I well remember one spring evening. I and Rory had been out for the day. Rory was the horse that mostly went with me when a pair was ordered, and an honest, good fellow he was. We had our own driver, and as he was always considerate and gentle with us, we had a very pleasant day. We were coming home at a good smart pace about twilight. Our road turned sharp to the left, but as we were close to the hedge of our own side, and there was plenty of room for us to pass, our driver did not pull us in. As we neared the corner, I heard a horse and 2 wheels coming rapidly down the hill toward us. The hedge was high, and I could see nothing, but the next moment we were upon each other. Happily for me, I was on the side next to the hedge. Rory was on the right side of the pole, and had not even a shaft to protect him. The man who was driving was making straight for the corner, and when he came in sight of us, he had no time to pull over to his own side. The whole shock came upon Rory. The gig shaft ran right into his chest, making him stagger back with a cry I shall never forget. The other horse was thrown upon his haunches and one shaft broken. It turned out that it was a horse from our own stables, with a high-wheeled gig and the young men were so fond of. The driver was one of these random, ignorant fellows who didn't even know which was their own side of the road. Or if they didn't care. And there was poor Rory with his flesh torn open and bleeding, and the blood streaming down. They said if it had been a little more to one side, it would have killed him, and a good thing for him, poor fellow, if it had. As it was a long time before the wound was healed, and then he was sold for coal carting. And what that is, up and down those steep hills, only horses know. Some of the sights I saw there, where a horse had come downhill with a heavily loaded 2-wheeled cart behind him, on which no drag could be placed, made me sad even now to think of. After Rory was disabled, I often went in the carriage with a mare named Peggy, who stood in the stall next to mine. She was a strong, well-made animal, of a bright dun color, beautifully dappled, and with a dark brown mane and tail. There was no high breeding about her, but she was very pretty, and remarkably sweet-tempered and willing. Still, there was an anxious look about her eye, by which I knew she had some trouble. The first time we were out together, I thought she had a very odd pace. She seemed to go partly to a trot, partly to a canter, 3 or 4 paces, and then jump a little forward. It was very unpleasant for any horse who pulled with her, and it made me quite fidgety. Sorry about that. When we got home, I asked her what made her go in that odd, awkward way. "Ah," she said in a troubled manner, "I know my paces are very bad, but what can I do? It's really not my fault. It's just because my legs are so short. I stand nearly as high as you, but your legs are a good 3 inches longer above your knees than mine, and of course you can take a much longer step and go much faster. You see, I did not make myself. I wish I could have done so. I would have had long legs then, and all my troubles come from my short legs," said Peggy in a desponding tone. "But how is it," I said, "when you are so strong and good-tempered and willing?" "Why, you see," she said, "men will go so fast, and if one can't keep up with the other horses, it's nothing but whip, whip, whip all the time. And so I have to keep up as I could, and have got into this ugly shuffling pace. It was not always so. When I lived with my first master, I always went a good regular trot, and then he was not in such a hurry. He was a young clergyman in our country, and a good, kind master he was. He had 2 churches a good way apart, and a great deal of work, but he never scolded or whipped me for not going faster. He was very fond of me. I only wish I was with him now, but he had to leave and go to a large town, and so I was sold to a farmer." Some farmers, are capital masters, but I think this one was a low sort of man. He cared nothing about good horses or good driving. He only cared about going fast. When I went as fast as I could, that would not do, and he was always whipping. So I got into this way of making a spring forward to keep up. On market nights, he used to stay very late at the inn and then drive home at a gallop. One dark night, he was galloping home as usual, when all of a sudden the wheel came against some great heavy thing in the road and turned the gig over in a minute. He was thrown out and his arm broken, and some of his ribs, I think. At any rate, it was the end of my living with him, and I was not sorry. But you see, it will be the same everywhere for me, if men must go so fast. I wish my legs were longer. Poor Peggy. I was very sorry for her, and I could not comfort her, for I knew how hard it was upon slow-paced horses to be put with fast ones. All the whipping comes to their share, and they can't help it. She was often used in the phaeton, and was very much liked by some of the ladies, because she was so gentle. And some time after this she was sold to 2 ladies who drove themselves and wanted a good, safe horse. I met her several times out in the country, going at a good, steady pace. And looking as gay and contented as a horse could be. I was very glad to see her, for she deserved a good place. After she left us, another horse came in her stead. He was young, and had a bad name for shying and starting, by which he had lost a good place. I asked him what made him shy. Well, I hardly know, he said. I was timid when I was young, and was a good deal frightened several times, and if I saw anything strange, I used to turn and look at it. You see, with our blinkers on, one can't understand what a thing is unless one looks round. And then my master always gave me a whipping, which of course made me start on, and did not make me less afraid. I think if he would have let me just look at things quietly and see there was nothing to hurt me, it would have been all right, and I should have got used to them. One day, an old gentleman was riding with him, and a large piece of white paper rag blew across just on one side of me. I shied and started forward. My master, as usual, whipped me smartly, but the old man cried out, "You're wrong! You're wrong! You should never whip a horse for shying. He shies because he is frightened, and you only frighten him more and make the habit worse. So I suppose all men don't do so. I'm sure I don't want to shy for the sake of it, but how should one know what is dangerous and what is not, if one is never allowed to get used to anything? I'm never afraid of what I know. Now, I was brought up in a park where there was a deer. Of course I knew them well, as I did sheep or cow, but they are not common, and I know many sensible horses are frightened at them, and who kick up quite a shindy before they will pass a paddock where there are deer. I knew what my companion said was true, and I wished that every young horse had a good master as Farmer Gray and Squire Gordon. Of course, sometimes we came in for good driving here. I remember one morning I was put into a light gig and taken to a house in Pulteney Street. 2 gentlemen came out. The taller of them came round to my head. He looked at the bit and bridle and just shifted the collar with his hand to see if it fitted comfortably. "Do you consider this horse wants a curb?" he said to the holster. "Well," said the man, "I should say he would go just as well without. He has an uncommon good mouth, and though he has a fine spirit, he has no vice. But we generally find people like a curb." "I don't like it," said the gentleman. "Be so good as to take it off, and put the rein in at the cheek. An easy mouth is a great thing on a long journey, is it not, old fellow?" he said, patting my neck. Then he took the reins, and they both got up. I can remember now how quietly he turned me round, and then with a light feel of the rein and drawing the whip gently across my back, we were off. I arched my neck and set off at my best pace. I found I had someone behind me who knew how a good horse ought to be driven. It seemed like old times again and made me feel quite gay. This gentleman took a great liking of me, and after trying me several times with the saddle, he prevailed upon my master to sell me to a friend of his, who wanted a safe, pleasant horse for riding. So it came to pass that in the summer I was sold to Mr. Barry. That is where we shall end for today. We'll see you again next time. Goodbye.